The officer was standing outside my van at 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the look on his face when he came back from running my license was not the look of a man who had found an expired registration. It was the look of a man who had found something he was not trained to find, in a database he scans 100 times a shift, on a night when he expected nothing more complicated than telling a homeless guy to move along before the store manager called it in again. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." I was in the back of my 2014 Ford Transit, zipped into a sleeping bag, in the far corner of a Kroger parking lot off Shelbyville Road in Louisville, Kentucky. This was not the first time someone in a uniform had knocked on my window. When you sleep in a van in a grocery store lot, which most of them tolerate quietly, because every manager in America knows the economy keeps producing people who have nowhere else to close their eyes, you learn the rhythm of these visits. You learn to keep your license in the cup holder ready. You learn to say yes, officer, and no, officer, and to keep your hands where they can be seen, because the distance between sleeping in a parking lot and waking up in a holding cell is measured in tone of voice and the speed with which you comply. "Everything all right, officer?" "Step out, please, sir." I stepped out. November in Louisville isn't November in Chicago, but at 41 degrees in a hoodie and the same work jeans I'd been wearing for 3 days, it found the bone. The officer was young, maybe 30, with a name tag that read Prout and the careful, slightly too still posture of a man who has just read something on his screen that moved the situation from routine to something he didn't have a box to check for. "Mr. Calder, I ran your license. Standard stop, but there's a flag attached to your file." A flag. I'd had warrants threatened over unpaid parking tickets before. I assumed that was the territory we were in. "A federal flag, sir, from 1988. 1988, I almost laughed. "Officer, I was a kid in 1988. I understand that. The flag isn't on your record, it's attached to your social security number." He paused, and I watched him choose the next words the way a man chooses his footing on ice. "It's marked WITSEC. "A what?" "Witness security, U.S. Marshals Service." Another pause. "According to this, sir, the identity you're carrying, the name Roy Calder, this identity doesn't belong to you." "Not the way you think it does. It was issued, and the system says the Marshals have been trying to locate you for about 2 years." I stood in that grocery store parking lot in my sock feet, the cold concrete pulling the warmth straight out of me, and I listened to a 30-year-old police officer tell me that my name was not my name. "Locate me for what?" "The flag says case closure and asset release. That's all I can see from my terminal." "I have to call the Marshals Louisville office, and I need you to stay right here, sir." He walked back to his cruiser, and I stood beside the van I'd been living in since the spring, the van that held my sleeping bag and a milk crate of clean shirts, and a cooler with lunch meat, and a single cardboard box with the last paperwork from a carpentry business that no longer existed. And I looked at the shopping carts lined up against the storefront like soldiers waiting for a war that was never coming, and I tried to make the words rearrange into something I could understand. But before I tell you what the Marshals told me, before Brooklyn, before the sealed record, before the letter from a dead man, I have to tell you how a man with 2 good hands and 30 years of trade behind him ended up asleep in a van at 52. Because the federal flag is only the second half of the story. The first half is the man my father-in-law set out to destroy. My name, the name I'd carried for 52 years, was Roy Calder. I was a carpenter. Not a handyman, not a guy with a circular saw and a Craigslist ad. A Finnish carpenter, a builder. I framed houses and hung doors and built staircases with treads so level you could roll a marble down the rail and watch it stop where you told it to. I built custom cabinetry, mantels, the kind of trim work that turns a builder-grade box into something a family walks into and decides to grow old in. I started Calder Custom Carpentry in 2006 when I was 33, with a used truck, a borrowed table saw, and a reputation for showing up when I said I would. In the trades, showing up when you say you will is a competitive advantage because the business is full of men who quote one number and bill another, who start a job and vanish for 2 weeks, who leave a kitchen gutted while they chase a bigger paycheck across town. I didn't do those things. I showed up. I did what I said I'd do. I charged what I quoted. And over 17 years, I built a company with 9 employees, real annual revenue, and a waiting list of homeowners and contractors across the Louisville metro who had learned that my word held. I was not a rich man. I made a comfortable living, the kind that buys a modest house and a decent truck and not much beyond it. My hands were permanently nicked and calloused, my knuckles thick, my forearms scarred from 1,000 small accidents with chisels and routers. I was a blue-collar man, and I was proud of what those hands had made, because I'd made it with labor and reliability, and a specific kind of intelligence that knows how wood moves with the seasons, how a joint should breathe, how to read a grain before you cut against it. In 2009, I met Diane Whitfield at a job site. I was installing a library floor-to-ceiling walnut shelving in a house her family was selling, and she came by to check on the staging. She was 31, sharp, easy to laugh, the daughter of Garrett Whitfield, who owned Whitfield Residential, one of the larger home builders in the region. Garrett put up subdivisions, the kind of master plan developments that roll across old farmland like carpet, each house a near copy of the last, each one trimmed and finished by a subcontractor Garrett personally approved. Dan and I were a mismatch, and we both knew it. She'd grown up in a house with a circular drive and a name on the gate posts. I'd grown up over a hardware store my grandfather ran until it folded. She'd gone to a private college. I'd gone straight from high school into an apprenticeship. She wore cashmere. I wore Carhartt. She smelled like something French. I smelled like sawdust and wood glue. We fell in love anyway because love doesn't audit your tax returns, and because Diane, before her father's gravity pulled fully around her, was the kind of woman who could see past the sawdust to the man under it. We married in the spring of 2010. The engagement dinner 3 months before was the first time I sat across from Garrett Whitfield in a setting where he couldn't pretend not to see me. He was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of man who builds neighborhoods he'd never consent to live in. He let me get halfway through my entree before he set down his fork. "So, you're the carpenter?" "Yes, sir." "And you think you're going to marry my daughter?" "I'm going to marry your daughter, Mr. Whitfield. I'm not thinking about it. She already said yes." He didn't care for that. Garrett Whitfield was not a man accustomed to correction from men who worked with their hands. "Let me be clear with you, son. You will never be good enough for our family, not because you're a bad man, because you're a small one, small trade, small ambitions, small life. Diane deserves more than a man whose finest achievement is a nice set of stairs." He said it at the table, in front of Diane, and she looked down at her plate and said nothing. Her silence at that table was the first crack in a foundation that would take 13 years to finally give way. She didn't defend me. She didn't stand up. She didn't say, "Dad, that's enough." She studied the rim of her water glass, as if the answer to her family's whole arrangement was hiding somewhere in the ice, and her father let the verdict hang in the air, and then he picked his fork back up as though he'd merely commented on the weather. The marriage wasn't terrible. It wasn't wonderful either. It was the particular kind of marriage that forms between a woman who loves a man her family looks down on, and a man who spends every day of his life trying to prove the verdict wrong. I worked harder. I took on bigger jobs, hired more men, chased more contracts. Every dollar I earned was a rebuttal to Garrett Whitfield's dinner table sentence, and every rebuttal landed short because the verdict was never about money. It was about class. And in Garrett's world, class isn't something you earn with your hands. It's something you're handed at birth, and I'd been handed nothing. Our daughter, Nora, was born in 2012. Our son, Will, in 2015. Nora has my stubbornness and her mother's quick eyes, a girl who argues like a trial lawyer and forgives like nobody's business. Will has my quiet, the kind of boy who watches a room for a full minute before he decides whether to enter it. For a while, the children softened things. Garrett warmed toward his grandchildren the way hard men sometimes do, not toward me, never toward me, but toward the idea that his daughter's marriage had at least produced something he could be proud to claim. He came to birthdays. He bought Will a tackle box and took him fishing. He performed the role of grandfather with the same rehearsed competence he brought to every other role he played. But underneath the performance, something was being assembled. And in 2022, Garrett finally set it in motion. I didn't see it coming because I was a carpenter and not a strategist. I understood how to make a thing stand level for 50 years. I did not understand the patient, methodical way a powerful man dismantles another man's life when he's decided to and has the resources to do it cleanly. The contractor relationships went first. 3 builders I'd subcontracted under for years, all of them tied, one way or another, into Garrett's network, stopped returning my calls within the same quarter. No reasons given that you could put your finger on. Going a different direction. Bringing finish work in-house. Tightening the vendor list. The truth was a series of quiet phone calls, the kind worded too carefully to ever be actionable, suggesting that Calder Custom Carpentry was not a company a serious builder wanted his name attached to. Then the money. Diane, who had been drifting back toward her father's orbit a little more every year, began pulling funds out of the joint accounts that floated the business. Not all at once. A few thousand here, a larger withdrawal there. Operating cash I needed for materials, for tools, for making payroll on the 15th and the 30th. When I finally confronted her about it, she didn't flinch. My father says the business is overextended. I'm protecting our family's position. Your father says. I heard my own voice go flat. Your father says everything, Diane. When's the last time something came out of your mouth that didn't come out of his first? She looked at me then with an expression I'd come to recognize later for what it was, the look of a woman who has already decided, and is only waiting for the man across from her to catch up to a conclusion she reached months ago. Maybe he's right about you, Roy. And then came her brother, Spencer Whitfield, a construction attorney with a smirk he'd inherited along with everything else, filed a complaint in early 2023 with the state licensing board. The complaint alleged that Calder Custom Carpentry had performed structural work on a project in Prospect without the proper licensing. It was a lie, top to bottom. But a complaint triggers an investigation, and an investigation freezes your license, and a frozen license is the beginning of the end. The allegation was fabricated, and I knew it, and so did Spencer when he signed his name to it. I held the proper licensing for every job I had ever touched, and the Prospect project he named had been pulled, permitted, and inspected by the county, with the paperwork to prove it sitting in my own files. None of that mattered in the short term. A complaint doesn't have to be true to do its work. It only has to exist long enough to freeze you. My license was suspended for 5 months while the board investigated. 5 months in which I couldn't pull a permit, couldn't bid a job, couldn't legally swing a hammer for pay. My men, 9 carpenters who had trusted me with their mortgages and their kids' braces, started drifting to other crews because I couldn't promise them a paycheck past Friday. I didn't blame a single one of them. A man with a family can't wait around on the word of a licensing board. By the time the investigation closed me out, fully cleared, no violation found, complaint dismissed in a single paragraph of bureaucratic language, the company was already a corpse. Revenue at zero. Crew gone. Accounts drained. Calder Custom Carpentry. 17 years built from a used truck and a borrowed saw, and a man who showed up when he said he would, dismantled in 11 months by a father-in-law who had decided, at a dinner table in 2009, that the man his daughter married would never be good enough. Diane filed for divorce in the summer of 2023. Garrett's attorneys ran it, and they ran it the way a developer runs a demolition, efficiently, without ceremony, and with a result decided long before the first wall came down. She kept the house, which it turned out Garrett had quietly financed and titled in her name years before. She kept primary custody of Nora and Will. She kept the good car. I walked out with my truck, a duffel of clothes, my tools, and a little under $9,000. The last thing Garrett said to me was in the courthouse hallway after the final hearing. He stood there in a suit worth more than everything I own put together, and he watched me walk past with nothing in my hands, and he said it again, soft, almost gentle, like a man closing a ledger. I told you, not good enough. I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, I had 13 years of it stacked up behind my teeth, but because words don't work on men like Garrett Whitfield. Rage doesn't reach them. Profanity bounces off. Men like that are moved by money, by power, by status, and I had been stripped of all three in a courtroom that afternoon. So I kept my mouth shut and I kept walking, and that walk took me by a slow road into the back of a van. The 9,000 lasted 2 months. After that, I worked day labor, framing crews, demo jobs, finished work for other outfits, cash in hand, the kind of work where the foreman doesn't ask to see a license. I made $600-700 a week when the work was steady, less when it wasn't. I paid child support when I could and apologized when I couldn't. I ate from gas stations and a church pantry off Bardstown Road that never once made me feel small for being there. I showered at a truck stop on I-65 that charged for it twice a week, because dignity has a price, and that was the one I could afford. I saw Nora and Will every other Saturday. I'd pick them up in the transit and take them to Cherokee Park, with its long sloping greens and the old stone bridges, and I'd watch my 11-year-old daughter clock the sleeping bag in the back of the van and not say anything, because she was old enough to understand and kind enough to spare me. Will was 8, young enough to think a van you could sleep in was an adventure. Nora knew better, and the day she finally asked me where I was staying was the day I understood exactly how far I'd fallen. "Dad, where do you sleep?" We were sitting on the grass at Cherokee Park, the late afternoon going gold through the sycamores, Will down the slope chasing a dog that wasn't his. Nora had her knees pulled up to her chest, and she asked it the way kids ask the questions they already know the answers to, quietly, watching my face instead of waiting for my words. "I'm between places right now, sweetheart. Mom says you live in the van." Mom's right, but I'm working on it. Is it because of Grandpa? I looked at my daughter, 11 years old and already laying out the pieces. The grandfather who never approved, the mother who drifted, the father who lost the company and then the house and then the floor under his own feet. I could see her connecting them behind her eyes, building the structure of it the way I'd taught her to read a set of plans. "Your grandpa and I don't see things the same way, but that's between him and me. It's not something you carry. I carry it anyway." "I know," I said. "And I'm sorry." Will came pounding back up the hill then, breathless, wanting to tell me about the dog, and the moment closed over like water. But it stayed with me, the sight of my own daughter shouldering a weight that belonged to the men who put it there. Will, for his part, never asked the hard questions. He held my hand crossing the parking lot. He told me about his class and a kid named Marcus and a video game I'd never understand. He drew me pictures the way little kids do, and his were always houses with too many windows and a chimney with a crooked line of smoke and a sun jammed up in the corner of the page. "That's our house," he told me once, sliding it across the picnic table. "The one you're gonna build. Is that right? You build stuff so you can build us a house." "I can," I said, and I meant it even though I had no idea how. "What's it got?" "A porch and a swing and my own room." "What color's your room?" He thought about it the way 8-year-olds think about important matters, with his whole face. "Blue, dark blue, like the deep part of the ocean. Then it's blue, deep ocean blue." He nodded, satisfied, as if the matter were now settled, as if his father's words still moved the world the way it once had. And maybe that was the cruelest part of those months, not the cold, not the truck stop showers, not the foreman who counted out my cash without quite looking at me. It was the way my kid still believed me, while sliding his drawings across the table like blueprints he expected me to honor. Nora deciding, against all the evidence in front of her, that her father was a man who would find his way back up. They had no reason left to believe it, and they believed it anyway. That was my life for 14 months. A van and a sleeping bag and a milk crate of clean shirts. A succulent of all things that I'd set on the dash because a man who builds things needs something living in his line of sight. Day labor and gas station coffee, and every other Saturday at Cherokee Park. And a young officer named Prout who tapped on my window at 10:47 on a Tuesday night in November, and told me that the name I'd answered to for 52 years was issued to me by the United States government. 2 days after that traffic stop, I sat in a conference room at the U.S. Marshals Service Field Office on West Broadway in Louisville. Across the table from me sat a deputy U.S. Marshal named Tessa Wynn, mid-40s, the WITSEC coordinator assigned to what she called a case closure. She had a file folder in front of her, the same way attorneys have folders and surgeons have charts, a whole life pressed flat into paper and tabs. She folded her hands on top of it and looked at me with a steadiness I'd come to understand was practiced. "Mr. Calder," she said, and I'll explain this, Mr. Brennan. There are some things about your family you were never told." "The officer told me my identity was issued," I said, "by the Marshals in 1988. "That's correct." She opened the folder, not looking down at it, the way a person handles material they've long since memorized. "Your birth name is Sean Brennan. You were born on March 3, 1973, at Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. Your parents were Patrick and Maeve Brennan. You were relocated to Kentucky under the Witness Security Program in early 1988 when you were 14 years old. 14. Not a toddler who'd never know the difference. 14, old enough to have a whole first life I was now being told I'd forgotten, or buried, or had buried from me. My parents were Tom and Eileen Calder," I said. The names came out of me automatically, the way they had for half a century. Those were the identities assigned to them by the service. Your father's name was Patrick Brennan. Your mother was Maeve. They were from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Bay Ridge. I had never been to Brooklyn in my life. I'd never been east of the Appalachians. My entire world was Kentucky and the river towns around it, and now a federal officer was telling me that the world was a set built around a frightened family to keep us breathing. Why? I asked. Why were we put in protection? She turned a page. In 1987, the federal government was building a racketeering case against the Longshoremen's Union Local on the Brooklyn waterfront, and behind it, the crime family that controlled the docks. Your father drove a delivery truck for a shipping company that was being used to move stolen cargo and launder cash through phantom freight invoices. He wasn't a member of anything. He was a driver. But he kept his own records out of habit, out of a working man's instinct to cover himself, and those records turned out to be a roadmap. My father. I had a sudden, sharp memory of the man I'd called Tom Calder, quiet, ordinary, a maintenance supervisor at a bottling plant outside Louisville for 30 years. A man who fixed his own cars and never raised his voice, and never, not once, hinted that he had ever been anyone but exactly who he appeared to be. The FBI approached him in late 1987, Tessa went on. They asked for his cooperation. He gave it. He turned over 4 years of his own logbooks, and then he testified to a grand jury and later at trial. His testimony and his records helped convict 11 men, including the local's president and 2 officers of the controlling organization. It broke the union's grip on that stretch of the waterfront. My father brought down the docks. Your father provided records and testimony that made the case possible. In exchange, the Marshals Service placed your family, Patrick, Maeve, and you into WITSEC. New names, new state, new life. Your parents were instructed never to reveal their former identities to anyone, including you. They were to tell you the move was for your father's work, nothing more. They never told me. I said it more to the table than to her. They were legally bound not to. But I've worked these cases for 19 years, Mr. Brennan, and I'll tell you something the file won't. The parents who keep the secret longest aren't the most obedient ones. They're the most frightened ones. Your father didn't keep quiet because a marshal told him to. He kept quiet because he believed that the day you knew the truth was the day you'd be in danger. He carried that fear to the grave so that you would never have to carry it at all. Is it over? My voice didn't sound like mine. The danger. The last man convicted on your father's testimony died in prison in 2020. The organization that ran that waterfront no longer exists in any form that could touch you. The case has been formally closed. She let that settle. Which is why we've been looking for you. 2 reasons. The first is required by law. We have to notify a protected person when the threat is resolved. The second is the one the officer mentioned at your van. She turned another page. Asset release. Asset release, I repeated. The phrase meant nothing to me. Assets were what other people had. My assets were a van, a sleeping bag, and a succulent on the dashboard. When your family entered the program in 1988, Tessa said, certain property and funds were frozen and moved into a federal trust. They couldn't be touched under your family's real names. Accessing them would have exposed who you were and where you'd gone. So they were held. They've sat in trust for 37 years, accruing value, waiting for the case to close. She slid a single summary sheet across the table and turned it to face me. 4 lines, 4 numbers. These are now releasable to you as the sole surviving heir of Patrick and Maeve Brennan. I looked down at the page. Item 1, she said. The Brennan family home, a brownstone on Senator Street in Bay Ridge, purchased by your parents in 1979. It's been maintained by a federal property trust since 1988, not renovated, just kept up. Taxes paid, roof sound. Current appraised value, approximately $4.6 million. I read the number twice. My parents, the maintenance supervisor, and the woman I'd called Eileen Calder, who'd worked the register at a fabric store and clipped coupons until the day she died, had owned a brownstone in Brooklyn that was now worth $4.5 million. And I had spent the last 14 months sleeping in a Ford Transit in a Kroger lot. Item 2, a life insurance policy on your father's life, $250,000 at face value. It paid out when he passed in 2009. The proceeds have been held in trust since with interest. Current value, roughly $390,000. Item 3, a savings account in the Brennan name at a Brooklyn bank, $41,000 at the time of relocation. 37 years of compounding puts it around $140,000 now. Item 4. She paused on this one, the way she'd paused at the van, choosing her footing. A federal victim restitution allocation. When a cooperating witness contributes to a racketeering prosecution that results in asset forfeiture, the witness, or the witness's family, is entitled to a share of what's recovered. The forfeiture in your father's case totaled just over $26 million. The formula allocated $1.7 million to the Brennan family. It's been held pending closure of the case. She set the paper down flat and folded her hands again. Total assets now releasable to you, Mr. Brennan, come to approximately $6.8 million. I sat very still. The room was warm, they kept those federal offices warm, and yet my hands had begun to shake on the tabletop. A fine tremor I couldn't stop and didn't try to. It wasn't the cold. It was the specific neurological short circuit of a man who has been counting out gas station change for over a year, who has measured dignity in $12 showers, suddenly told that nearly $7 million has been sitting in a vault with his name on it. His real name, a name he hadn't known he owned an hour before this meeting in his life. There's one more item, Tessa said. It isn't financial. She reached down beside her chair and lifted a box onto the table, a reinforced cardboard archive box, sealed with a Marshals service evidence tag along one edge, the tag yellowed at the corner. She set it in front of me with a care that told me she'd done this before and knew exactly what it cost the person on my side of the table. When your family went into the program, she said, your parents were required to surrender every physical trace of who they'd been. Photographs, documents, anything that could connect them to the Brennan name. It was all logged and put into federal storage. It stayed there for 37 years. She nudged it half an inch toward me. The case is closed now, Mr. Brennan. This belongs to you. I looked at the box for a long moment before I touched it. A whole sealed life, taped shut and tagged, sitting on a government table between two strangers. Then I broke the seal and lifted the lid, and inside, wrapped in sheets of acid-free tissue, were the pieces of a man I had been and never known. Photographs first. My parents, young, dark-haired, impossibly young, standing on a stoop in front of a brownstone I now apparently owned but had never laid eyes on. My mother in a summer dress, squinting into the sun, holding a baby that was me. My father in a windbreaker, leaning against a chain-link fence with the Verrazano Bridge a gray smudge behind him, grinning the careless grin of a man who didn't yet know what was coming for his family. There was a photograph of the three of us at a kitchen table crowded with serving dishes, a Sunday table, the kind that takes all day to set and 20 minutes to clear, and my father had his arm around my mother and a fork raised like he was toasting whoever held the camera. And there I was. A boy I half recognized, maybe 10, 11 years old in the latest of them, gap-toothed in a striped shirt, standing in a small backyard with a brick wall behind me. I stared at that boy a long time. I had no memory of him. The Marshals had moved us when I was 14, Tessa had said, and somewhere in the machinery of becoming Roy Calder, the boy in the striped shirt had been quietly filed away, sealed in a box, kept from me by two people who loved me enough to erase him. Beneath the photographs, a wedding portrait. Patrick and Maeve Brennan, 1971, in front of a stone church, St. Patrick's. The back of the photo said, in my mother's looping hand, Bay Ridge. She wore a dress with a high lace collar. He wore a borrowed-looking suit and a boutonniere a size too large. They were laughing at something just off camera. Two kids with no idea that the life they were starting would one day have to be surrendered, name and all, to keep the child they hadn't met yet alive. And at the bottom of the box, beneath everything, a sealed envelope. My name on the front, my real name, Sean Brennan, in handwriting I had never once seen in my life. Not the hand of Tom Calder, which I knew as well as my own, tighter than that, more cramped. The hand of a man who'd learned to write in another borough, under another name, in another life entirely. I opened it. One page. No date. If you're reading this, the case is finished and the Marshals have found you. That means I'm gone and your mother's gone, and you've just learned that nearly everything we ever told you about where we came from was a lie. I need you to understand why we lied to you. In the winter of 1987, two men came to our apartment. They weren't police. They sat at our kitchen table, the same table where your mother made Sunday dinner, the same table where you did your homework, and they told me that if I testified, they wouldn't come for me. They'd come for you. They said it plainly, the way you discussed the weather. A 14-year-old boy. They told me they could make you disappear and that I'd spend the rest of my life not knowing where. I testified anyway. I want you to know that. Not because I was brave, I was terrified the whole time, every single day, but because the alternative was hauling stolen cargo for men who would threaten a child over a dinner table, and I could not live as that man and still call myself your father. We gave up everything. The house. The neighborhood. Your grandmother died not knowing what state we lived in. I couldn't go to my own brother's funeral. We let Brooklyn go so that you could grow up in Kentucky with your 2 arms and your 2 legs and a future. I don't know what kind of man you turned into. I hope a good one. I hope you build things. You always wanted to build things, even small, even back then. The house on Senator Street is yours. The money is yours. The name Brennan is yours if you want it. And I'm sorry that the only inheritance I could leave you had to be hidden, because the world I came from was one where the truth could get a man's son killed. Be honest. Be better than the lie we had to live. Your father, Patrick Brennan. I sat in that warm federal conference room and held a letter from a dead man who had given up everything he was, his name, his city, his brother's funeral, the sound of his own mother's voice on the telephone, to keep me breathing. The man I had called Tom Calder. The quiet supervisor who fixed the neighbors' lawnmowers for free and fell asleep in his recliner during the 10 o'clock news and never raised his voice in 52 years of my knowing him. He had walked into a federal courtroom and testified against men who had promised, over his own kitchen table, to come for his 14-year-old son. And then he had walked out of his entire life and never once looked back, and he had carried the whole crushing weight of it in silence so that I would never have to feel its edges. The man whose death in 2009 I had grieved as the passing of an ordinary, modest, unremarkable person was the bravest human being I have ever known. I left the marshal's office a little after 4 in the afternoon. I sat in the van, the same van, the sleeping bag still in the back, the succulent still on the dash in the parking lot of a federal building, and I called my kids. Nora picked up. "Dad, hey, sweetheart, you sound weird. Are you okay?" "I'm okay. Something happened today, something big. I'll tell you about it Saturday." "Big good or big bad?" "Big good, really good. Nora, I think I'm getting us a house." There was a silence on the line, and then, carefully, the way she'd learned to be careful, "A real one, a real one." I heard her cover the phone and yell for her brother. Will got on, breathless. "Dad, Nora says we're getting a house." "We are, buddy. With my own room, your own room. Deep ocean blue, every inch you want. 6 months have passed now. It's late spring. The asset transfer took the better part of 4 months. Federal trusts don't move quickly, and there were verifications and filings, and a court order to change my legal name from Roy Calder back to the one on a baptismal certificate I'd never seen until it came out of a box. Most people in Louisville still call me Roy, because that's the name they've had for me, and changing what a town calls a man is slower than changing what a document says. The brownstone on Senator Street appraised at $4.8 million, a little higher than Tessa's number, because the Brooklyn market did what the Brooklyn market always does between winter and spring, which is climb. I have not sold it. I flew to New York in March, my first time on an airplane, my first time east of the mountains, 52 years old and pressing my forehead to the window like Will would have. I took a cab to Bay Ridge, and I stood on Senator Street in front of a limestone-fronted row house with the original iron railing, and a stoop my mother had swept before I was old enough to hold a broom. The trust had maintained it, not renovated it. The same floors my parents walked. The same kitchen where 2 men sat down and threatened a boy's life over coffee. And out back, a narrow garden, maybe 20 feet deep, with a brick wall along the rear, the same brick wall I'd stood against in a striped shirt in a photograph I'd held 2 months before. Against that wall, an old climbing rose, gone wild and woody after decades untended, was throwing out new green canes toward the light, still alive, still reaching after 37 years of nobody to tend it. I build things. I understand how a thing endures or fails, how it stands or gives way. And standing in that Brooklyn yard, looking at a rosebush my mother must have planted in the 70s, still climbing that wall 4 decades after she'd been forced to leave it, I understood something no amount of money in any trust could have taught me. My parents didn't just survive what was done to them. Even on their way out the door of the only life they'd known, they had planted something, and it had outlasted them. And so somehow had I the insurance, the savings, the restitution, All of it has cleared into accounts that bear my real name. After taxes and legal fees, a little over $5.5 million. The brownstone is worth another 4.8 if I sell it, and I am not going to sell it. I'm going to restore it with my own hands where I can, because a house on Senator Street in Bay Ridge is not an asset on a summary sheet. It's the place where two terrified, ordinary, magnificent people fell in love and planted a rosebush and raised a boy and gave up the entire world so that boy could grow up safe in another state, under another name, with sawdust on his hands instead of blood. I bought a house in Louisville, a 3-bedroom near Cherokee Park, nothing extravagant, with a porch and a yard front and back. A room for Nora. A room for Will, painted deep ocean blue before he'd even seen it, so it would be done when he walked in. There's a swing on the porch. The custody arrangement is 50-50 now, shared equal. Diane didn't fight it. I think, though I can't be sure and have stopped needing to be, that she's relieved. Relieved her children's father isn't sleeping in a van anymore. Relieved, maybe, that the thing her family called not good enough turned out to be the son of a man who stared down the people who ran a waterfront and walked away from his whole life to protect his child. Diane and I have not talked about the Brennan story. The court filings made it public enough that her father's network picked it up. I know Garrett knows, because Spencer called me in April. The first time he dialed my number since he signed his name to the lie that killed my company. Roy, I heard about the federal thing. Is it true there are assets? How much? I told him it wasn't his business. He said he was only asking as family. I told him we weren't family, that he'd made certain of that himself, and I hung up. He hasn't called again. Garrett hasn't called at all. I don't expect he will. Because Garrett Whitfield measures a man by what he can see: the house, the car, the company, the line on a bank statement. And the one thing he could never see is the thing that makes me worth more than he will ever understand. Not the money. The fact that my father, a truck driver from Brooklyn who wore borrowed suits and drove a beat-up sedan, walked into a courtroom and testified against men who threatened his son, and then surrendered his name and his home and his entire history without a word of complaint for 37 years so that I could live. That is not a thing Garrett Whitfield has ever done. It is not a thing he is capable of doing. Garrett protects his holdings. Patrick Brennan protected his family. The distance between those two things is the distance between a man who builds subdivisions and a man who builds a life. I'm starting over. Not Calder Custom Carpentry. That name belonged to a man who no longer exists. The new shop is called Brennan and Son. There is no son in the business yet. Will is 9. But there will be if he wants it, and either way the name is a promise to a boy in a striped shirt in a photograph, and to the man who carried him out of Brooklyn in 1988. One truck, paid for, one set of tools, one man who knows how to make wood stand level for 50 years. The first client called last week, a woman in the East End who'd seen a staircase I'd built years ago under the old company name and wanted one like it. "Can you do something similar?" she asked. I told her I could do something better. "When can you start?" "Monday," I said. The same answer I've given for 30 years. The same answer I'll give for the next 30. Monday. I'll be there with my truck and my tools and my own 2 hands. So let me ask you something before you go. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough by a father-in-law, a boss, a system that weighs a man by what he owns instead of what he survived? And when they said it, some quiet part of you believed them. Garrett Whitfield looked across a dinner table at a carpenter and said I'd never be enough. He didn't know he was looking at the son of a man who faced down the worst people in the world and walked away from everything to save his child. Not good enough. The son of Patrick Brennan. I disagree. And so does that rose bush on Senator Street, still climbing. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story reached something in you, the van, the parking lot, the letter, the rose bush still alive after all those years, hit that like button and share it with somebody who's been told they're not enough. Share it with somebody sleeping in a vehicle tonight. Tell them what I'm telling you. Sometimes the life you were handed isn't the life you were born for, and sometimes at 10:47 on a Tuesday night, a cop runs your license and your real life finally begins. Subscribe so you never miss another story. I'll see you in the next one.